Facebook has been criticized in recent months for not doing enough to combat the spread of misinformation and hate speech. Now that fight is reportedly creating a divide within the company. It comes down to this: how can Facebook keep misinformation off of our feeds without hurting its bottom line? But the debate over how to do that has some employees raising the question, does Facebook care more about dominance or having a positive effect on the world? Joining us now to talk more about this is New York Times cybersecurity correspondent Shira Frankel. Shira, welcome. Great to see you. So what has Facebook done so far to battle the spread of misinformation?
Facebook's taken a number of steps that they really started taking after the 2018 midterm elections. And that's included everything from bringing on independent fact checkers to provide an outside sort of external audit on what is true and what is false, hiring more content moderators, creating, in general, an ecosystem where they've hired more security personnel to determine what misinformation is. So we've seen the company take serious steps to address this. And I think the question by employees is, are those steps enough? And is there more that the company can be doing?
So, even as Facebook comes under fire for its part in the spread of misinformation, the company says the news ecosystem quality changes were not meant to be permanent. What does it mean by that? And what kind of moral, and backlash is that creating within the company? Why aren't these changes meant to be permanent?
That's a great question, and I think one that Facebook employees were asking themselves. The news ecosystem quality is a metric that Facebook has been using internally for a long time to give a sort of ranking to news organizations. So imagine a scale of 1 to 10, and you would have news organizations that they believed had more sort of factual news on one end, and news organizations that perhaps carried more misinformation or just had in times violated sort of Facebook standards on what factual news would be. And so ahead of the elections, they decide that they're going to experiment with this, and they're going to try up-ranking the news organizations that consistently gave factual information. And they found that people's news feeds were quote unquote nicer. They were seeing more factual information, more accurate information at the top of their news feeds. However, Facebook's executives then told their employees the change was temporary and never meant to be permanent. And that's led to a sort of internal reckoning among employees, asking themselves, well, if we can do this, if we can sort of change up our own rankings, why aren't we regularly making the decision to show people factual news?
It's a good question. And, when you look back at the number of things that Facebook has been working on to battle misinformation leading up to the election, because they clearly had the election as a deadline in mind to sort of clean up their act, so to speak. One thing apparently being considered was something called correct the record, which would have alerted users, hey, you just interacted with a false news post, and here, let's direct you to a fact checker to kind of clear things up for you, which sounds like a great idea. But can you talk about why that idea and similar ones were not implemented by Facebook?
Again, I think Facebook's own employees and the people who worked on this project who we spoke to didn't quite understand why it was not implemented. As you said, it seemed like a very good idea. It was a tool in which if you shared misinformation, it would alert you about the fact that you were sharing something false, as well as if you had in the past shared something. So if in the last week you had shared a piece of information and then Facebook's fact checkers found that to be false, it would retroactively go back and let you know, you shared this thing about voting systems in Georgia or in, Michigan, which our own fact checkers have now found to not be true. And we're just letting you know that that one piece of information wasn't true. In interviews, Facebook's executives told us that the tool itself wasn't as effective as they once thought it to be, and that was the reason why it was not adopted. But the employees that we spoke to who worked on the project did think it was effective. And so there was kind of a mismatch there of what we were hearing from people who worked on this project and Facebook's executives.
Right. It sounds like a great idea. Again, what has Facebook learned from this election season, and what is the company doing to move forward? And when I ask you, what has it learned, I'm wondering if it also has learned that, cleaning up the site is not so profitable.
I think that has been part of the lesson. I think that in their own rankings, when they've seen what happens when they give people authoritative, factual news at the top of the newsfeed, and that is that people might spend less time. Now, I think employees are making the argument that people spend enough time on Facebook, and that it's not maybe necessary for Facebook to constantly be striving for this internal metric of how can we get people to spend as much time as possible. We want people to spend 8, 9 hours of their day on Facebook. And you have employees saying, well, hold on, if it's better for the world, if it's better for democracy to have people spending 4 hours a day on Facebook or 5 hours a day on Facebook, or maybe checking in 3 times a day instead of 5 times a day, isn't that something we should be able to accept as a company? And so I think that's really going to be the debate going forward, whether Facebook puts its own kind of growth and its own user numbers and the numbers that it has to show its board and the number it has to show its stockholders ahead of what it might think is just sort of better for the world.
Well, do we know where Zuckerberg stands in this argument? Because it sounds like there's this internal debate going on between, the employees, the rank and file, and the money people, right? And so it sounds like the kind of thing that's going to have to be resolved by someone like Zuckerberg. Do we know where he stands?
I think this is something that he wrestles with every single day and something he has meetings about every day. What we know about Mark Zuckerberg is that from the first day at Facebook, he was looking at those metrics. When he launched the news feed, people forget that news feed was only launched, more than a year after Facebook itself began as a company. The first thing Mark looked at was how much time were people spending on Facebook, and newsfeed made people spend more time on Facebook, and therefore it became the homepage, the landing page, and the thing that really distinguished Facebook from every other company. And so as a leader, what we've learned from him is that the amount of time people spend, the amount of time they check in to Facebook and spend scrolling, spend engaging, that is one of the most important internal metrics, and it guides a lot of his personal decisions about how to lead the company and what products he wants to implement. I imagine that right now that is coming up against, in many ways, what people are telling him is maybe best for us as a society. And so I think the next year is going to be really interesting to see how he guides Facebook and what it looks like when Facebook is also not operating under a Trump administration, which has been a constant source of difficult decisions for them.
Very, very interesting. Shira Frankel, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you for having me.